Hey, how y'all doing? Another week. We've got a group assembled yet again to discuss some stuff. We're going to talk about this week influential bands or albums. And we've got our friend, Matt, from The Dark Path here, all the way from beautiful California. And of course, Alan, again, from Let's Talk Metal.
Hello.
And I've linked both of these guys in the description this time. I neglected to do so the last couple streams, but we've done it this time. So please definitely go over and check out their channels. But we're here and we got a topic. And what do you think of when you think of bands that were labeled as influential?
Well, I thought the topic of discussion was bands that were ahead of their time.
Well, exactly.
Is that the same thing?
That's the same thing, yeah.
Okay.
That's a big part of it sometimes.
Ahead of their time.
Let's start off on the right page here, gentlemen.
Now, I'm glad someone knows what's going on around here.
that can be part of it, yeah. That some of the ones that have a big influence kind of come out of nowhere and just like don't sound like anybody else, and so people can gravitate towards that and they kind of go in a new direction.
I guess for me, it would be bands that, you know, when they come out of the gate, they sound so different from what else is going on in the scene that they can often be overlooked or ignored and maybe not even appreciated until much later. So
yep. That was me. Ahead of their time is code word for typically not liked initially.
Yeah.
Yep.
And,
it's not always true, but it does happen a lot. Yeah.
It does happen a lot.
They go over people's heads at first because it's not at all what you're expecting to hear.
Yep. And well, I've got a stack of stuff. I'm not feeling overly confident about a couple of the things I chose, but I think the bands that I've chosen were ahead of their time for different reasons, maybe. And I will start off by saying that these are opinions, and you have a different idea of how this should go, then start your own channel. Talk about it on your channel.
Gee, why don't you just be a dick about it, Marty?
No, I mean, we don't need people beating each other up in the streams and in the chat. Like, I guess there was some of that last week. I don't know. I didn't see it, but
I would say
conversation.
I would say with this topic in particular, it would be very easy for people's opinions to get pushed forward quite a bit, where you might think that your opinion is the authority on the issue, and that's not really where I came from with the albums that I picked to show. Like, the things that I picked are just because they're the ones I have in my collection. They're just a example of what we're talking about, not necessarily the example, like the pinnacle that, if you don't agree that this album is the one, then you're wrong.
Exactly.
No, it's just, these are just ones that I picked that I thought would be fun to talk about, and they are by no means an authority choice. They are just what I felt like picking and talking about. So there's my disclaimer from the Dark Path. The Dark Path disclaimer, everybody.
Well, having said that, why don't you start off the shindig and
sure,
see what you got.
Sure. Well, like I said at the very beginning, to me, a band ahead of their time is one that just isn't appreciated at that particular moment when it came out, and is sometimes only respected or revered much later on. And I think this band, more than any, really encompasses that, and that's Time Ghoul. This is a band that did the weird, spacey tech death kind of stuff way before anybody else was doing it. I mean, this came out in, at least their first demo came out in 1992. And in 1992, nobody knew what to do with this weird tech death that was really spacey and kind of ethereal and didn't make a lot of sense. And, it was a full year before stuff like Demilich was even out there. Yep. And it's a band that didn't even, nobody knew who they were. Nobody cared. They stayed a demo band until Dark Descent put their demos out in, 2017, whenever this repress came out. So, that's really when this band started to take off, is when the demos were put back out there and people listened to it and were like, oh, yeah, that sounds like a slew of other bands that I'm really into right now. And these guys are much bigger today than they ever were in 1992. So that is my first pick, is Time Ghoul. And how
Matt digging deep in the underground. Nice job.
You can't beat that album cover either. I mean, that is like one of the coolest covers of all time. I don't care what anybody says. That thing fucking rules. So
very cool.
Very cool.
Do we show off if we have cool, fancy, like splatter vinyl and stuff? Like, look at that.
Absolutely.
What happened on that?
Look how snot covered it is.
They missed a part of it.
They did. They missed a whole chunk. Look at that. That's for you to look through so you can see through time.
That's for DJs to put their hand on to scratch with.
That's the Die Hard edition. It's only 3/4 splatter.
Right, Mr. Allen, you're up.
Okay. Well, I'll see Matt's weird sci-fi spacey death metal thing and follow suit with Nocturnus.
Oh, good choice.
I almost picked that one, but I went with Time Ghoul instead.
You get the cult points for sure. But yeah, this one, when these guys came out, they were doing two things that were very different than other death metal bands. They went in the sci-fi direction instead of going into sort of, the more brutal gore, zombie, creepy, macabre stuff. And they included keyboards, which, was a huge deal at the time. It was just like, oh my God, are you allowed to do that and call yourself death metal? It was a risky kind of thing to do, but it went over relatively well. They actually, had a pretty good reception even early on. So this is one that, they didn't get panned for it or anything. And the band's always had a pretty good following. But just, in line with Time Ghoul there, it's interesting, even today, when you see a band in death metal go in this more sci-fi direction, it's still kind of a thing. It's still almost a novelty for bands to go in that direction, even though we've seen more bands do it with, Vector and Blood Incantation and everyone. It's still something that people are like, oh, that's cool. They're doing sci-fi. They're not doing, chainsaw guts fuck massacre, blah, blah, blah. So, Nocturnus was doing it in, the late 80s. And, so they've been at it for a long time and really kind of went their own direction, even though the music, was still very solid death metal. They very much had their own personality and it worked well for them. So
what did you think of their new album that came out, I think, last year or year before?
Oh, the Nocturnus BCAD. I liked it. It's one I haven't gone back and revisited a lot, but I thought it did a pretty good job of getting back to the spirit of the first two albums. I liked the third one as well, but it is its own creature. I mean, it has a very different lineup and such. But yeah, I liked the new one pretty good. I just haven't spun it as much as I thought I might have.
Yeah, I thought it was really good, but you're right. Like the replay factor on it is quite low. I just go back to the key or thresholds. I like thresholds a lot too.
Thresholds is cool. It's just, it's very different. I like the second one as well. The name's escaping me at the moment, but the second one was the first
Thresholds. The second one is Thresholds.
Oh yeah. Sorry, Thresholds. I'm thinking the third album. But yeah, Thresholds.
Ethereal Tomb. You're thinking of Ethereal Tomb.
Yeah, Thresholds has a lot of cool stuff. That was the one I first heard. And it really exemplified something they did well. Their songs sounded very adventurous. Each one was like this little mini adventure story with the different sound effects on the keyboard and stuff. They have the sound, I think it's Aquatica, where they're like all the bubbly sounds, like they're literally going underwater and stuff. And yeah, they just had, these very cool kind of, epic vibe in a way that you didn't get with, other styles of death metal back then.
No.
I think the main problem with Nocturnus for me is I really enjoyed their music. I love what they were doing with it, but Mike Browning's vocals always killed it for me. Since he's playing drums and singing at the same time, he follows the riffs verbatim, and it's incredibly boring. And that's what really killed the newest album for me. His vocals are so bland, so monotone, follows the riffs. It's just... You got this very adventurous mix of music, and the way they use the keyboards is very horrorphonic. It has like it isn't like typical pretty keyboard lines. It's like nightmarish sounding synth textures, and then you put this deadpan not very adventurous vocal patterns over it. Just it always kind of kill it. I love the key. I love thresholds, but the new one, I really struggled with it.
Yeah.
What about Ethereal Tomb? What about Ethereal Tomb? Did you like that one? Because that's with a different singer.
Yeah, I had it as a promo back in the day, and I didn't spend much time with it and got rid of it. In fact, I might still have it. I don't know, but
yeah, his vocals are a sticking point for other folks. You're not the only person I've heard mention that. Yeah, that Browning's vocals are just don't quite hit the mark for him.
Yeah. Well, next up, I'm going to pull this before anybody else does, but Cynic's Focus.
Mm-hmm.
I was that close. I was that close to picking that one.
This is an album, when it came out, it was very ahead of its time. It was their demos to this album is a very strange trajectory because it doesn't really sound it's quite more advanced than the demo material. And when this came out, people just did not get it. I didn't get it. In fact, I had a friend that saw them on this. They toured with the US with Cannibal Corpse and Sinister, which putting this band on with Cannibal Corpse and Sinister, who are straight up death metal, is a big fucking mistake. And he said there was people like booing them and get off the stage type shit. And times have changed. Things have become more complex and more adventurous and structurally interesting. And I think this album now is a lot more appreciated. Well, obviously enough so that the band got back together and came back with that Traced and Arrow, which is really good. After that, they got a lot less metal, which I really need to be in the mood for this, but I like it a lot more than I did when it came out. When it came out, I didn't get it. And again, it falls into that category, being ahead of your time isn't always a favorable tag. You know what I mean? But Cynic's Focus, definitely one of those bands.
Yeah. To me, that would be one of the real textbook examples of a band that was ahead of their time. Because you're right, nobody got that back in the day. I remember that CD very specifically at the local CD store, sitting there like in the $9 bin, and a few months later it got knocked into the $7 bin, and a few months later it got knocked into the $5 bin,
right?
And a few months later it got knocked into the $3 bin. Nobody would touch that album.
No,
I had heard a little bit of it. It's like, this is kind of interesting. It was over my head. I'm like, I'm not going to get this because, well, it's just not going to click with me right now. But yeah, that thing sat in that store for ages. It may still be there for all I know.
Well, now you look up an original pressing online, it goes for a shit ton of money. So
yeah,
there you go.
Now, Cynic was one of the first bands that kind of got me into weirder, more off-kilter music. And I first heard it in, I'm going to say 98, 99, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
So, I was definitely a latecomer to the world of Cynic, but it clicked with me right away. I thought it was a genius album, and I'm not as big a fan of anything else that they've done except for the demos and Focus.
Right.
But that's just me.
Speaking of just you're up.
Is it me? Is it my turn to go next? All right. Well, let's get a little crazy here. I picked Season of the Dead by Necrophagia for one reason and one reason only. And it's because a lot of people, there's a debate that I've seen on the internet, like who came first with this style of death metal. Was it Death or was it Necrophagia? And this album came out, I believe, a year before Scream Bloody Gore did.
Really?
And at the time, when this kind of stuff came out, it was still very thrash metal. Like death metal wasn't like a huge thing yet. And this is almost like spoken word death metal, thrash metal, like the way that Killjoy sings on this. It's very much just like he's kind of like talking in a way. So, this is something that, again, people ignored, and all of the fanfare went towards death. And I don't think anybody cared about Necrophagia until they came back a decade or so later with Phil Anselmo on board, and that got them a lot of hype. And then this thing got re-released, and then everybody suddenly was a big fan of Necrophagia, when no one had ever cared about this beforehand. So in a way, this is ahead of its time just because it is debatable about whether or not this was the first true death metal release or not. So,
and I would say, you know, I respect that band's pioneering, you know, because they were probably one of the first, but I didn't hear them until after I heard all the other bands. So to me, when I finally heard Necrophagia, I was like, you know, I can respect them, but I don't like them as much as these other bands. Probably because of just the talking style on that first one. And I've got weird. A couple albums. It's weird.
Yeah, it's really weird.
But, okay, Mr. Allen.
Okay, I'll go with something sort of old school. I'll go with Venom. Not just this album, but just anything early Venom is so much more over the top in terms of presentation than other stuff at the time. I mean, you had other bands that had sort of, you know, the satanic vibe about them, but it was always more like a sort of, you know, ooh, spooky, occult kind of stuff. And then, you know, these guys, it's just like big goat, big pentagram. I mean, there was the little blurb on the back cover that was, you know, the whole, you know, we spit on the virgin you worship and sit at Lord Satan's left side. They were just going to make it as extreme and in your face as they could, and nobody else was doing that this early. You know, every other band was doing like theatrical horror or, you know, other, you know, takes on being evil. And these guys are just like, no, we'll make it as raw and dirty and, you know, put in as many bad words and stuff as we can get away with. And obviously, I mean, it's, you know, has defined multiple genres over time. So I remember specifically, you know, having this album in high school, and I had friends that would not let me play this album if they were in the room. They would look at that back cover and read that little blurb, and they'd just stand back and be like, don't play that. I don't want to hear that. That's the kind of thing that, you know, we'll all end up like cutting our wrists open and trying to commit suicide if you play that album right now.
Right. And the thing that's funny is, and always amazed me, is they were lumped in with that new wave of British heavy metal tag, and they had, I don't know, they just never fit into that demographic for me anyway. I mean, they had a lot more punk going on than they had, you know, streamlined hard rock evolution like the new wave of British heavy metal did.
Yeah, musically, in a way, you know, what they're doing wasn't that far ahead of their time. They're taking a lot of punk and, you know, the dirtier, faster side of, you know, rock and early Motorhead and stuff, but they're just, you know, repackaging it, you know, in such a crazy way for that day and age. Today, nobody would bat an eyelash at it. It'd be like, yeah, sure, whatever. But yeah, for that day and age to have something that's just, you know, we're just going to be that blatantly crazy evil. And yes, I mean, if you were paying attention, you caught on very quickly that it was meant to be tongue in cheek, that it was just a marketing kind of thing. But you know, still other bands weren't willing to push it that hard or that far at the time whatsoever. So you know, it definitely sort of pushed the boundaries on that, you know, into a whole new level of what you could do presentation wise and be successful. You know, Venom is one that, again, they were successful early. This was well received and well liked and took off right away.
Well, it hit during the whole Satanic Panic scare too, which was a huge thing in the media, and they played right into that perfectly with their tongue-in-cheek lyrical Satanism stuff. And you know, Merciful Fate did too. It was a perfect storm for a band like that to get a lot of free publicity. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So I guess I'm next. I'm going to get this out of the way. People in the comments start throwing garbage because I'm going to talk about Kyuss. Why is this band? Why would this band be ahead of their time? Well, this album came out in '73, and look at them. Who was doing this in 1973? Nobody. They hid behind the fact that they were kind of just getting by talent-wise. I'm not saying they were untalented. There's some good songs on this album, but you know, they went for the image, and these guys were very much hated. Their first 3 albums didn't do much. It wasn't until their first live album, that they finally caught on, and it caught on like wildfire. And I guess what this band revolutionized is the way people go to arena rock shows today. I mean, they completely changed the face of rock with their little shtick that they had going on here, and they stuck to it. I mean, they made a mystique out of it. They made it a mystery in a time where there was no internet, and you could hide behind an image. You could come up with complete anonymity. I can't say the fucking word. You could go completely. No one could know who you are if you wanted to be that way. And for that, I mean, I love Kyuss. This is my first band ever when I was 8 or whatever in the 70s, and yeah, and I think they're ahead of their time. Is this album, are they doing anything on this album that's ahead of groundbreaking? No, not really. It's just rock songs about sex. But I mean, look at them. That to me is what really put them on the map.
Well, they kind of reinvented the whole like arena rock aspect too, like huge stage shows, gigantic theatrical presentations that no one had ever really seen before Kyuss, I don't think. So
yeah, I always
love
felt
them or hate them.
Yeah, I always felt that in a way Kyuss was also in the right place at the right time.
Yep.
And Marty, I think you and I've chatted about this a little bit, that right there in the mid 70s, you'd gone through a long period where music had gotten very serious for a lot of years. The airwaves were dominated by the Eagles and all this kind of AOR sounding stuff, and you had all these very more progressive bands were a big thing. You'd gone through all the hippie and psychedelic years where music had all this depth and meaning to it. And at the same time, you're going through the whole Vietnam thing, which, of course, by the mid 70s is a complete, wash, and it had a real negative psychological impact on the country. And I think Kyuss coming out and being like, hey, we're just going to do something that's big and fun and exciting and just, wow, blow your mind with something crazy. And I think people were really hungry for something like that by that point, that they just wanted to be like, I don't want every song I listen to be 22 minutes long and require a thesaurus just to understand the title. I'm sick of hearing about all the downer stuff. I just want to go and I want to go and cheer and hear these crazy space-looking guys play some fun rock and roll and kind of forget about all this downer shit for a while.
And Jeff brings up a good point that like Arthur Brown and Peter Gabriel were doing it in the 60s. I think Alice Cooper was on the same level as Kyuss as far as he was the only theatrical one in the band, but he had a theatrical show to go with it, cutting the head off and all that other stuff. Whereas Arthur Brown and Peter Gabriel, they didn't really take it to as big of a scale as Kyuss did, Peter Gabriel, I mean, with Genesis was more proggy and I don't know. It just seems like a different level for me. Whereas Alice Cooper would have been on that same trajectory as, Kyuss probably borrowed a lot from Alice Cooper. I think he was first, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Well, Alice Cooper too. I mean, he just wore eyeliner and some stuff around his mouth. Kyuss came out with full-blown comic book character personas.
They took it to the extreme for sure.
Yeah, but they're definitely borrowing from Alice Cooper and other stuff in the glam scene. But yeah, they kind of took the glam scene and made it a little, again, just they took the glam trappings and put it on top of a straight rock and roll chassis and took off down the road in it.
Right.
So in a way that they lost some of the issues that other glam acts had where it was easy to look at them and like this not quite heavy enough, or that's a little too weird, and the music it looks interesting but the music didn't click with some folks, and Kyuss is like, we'll take that look and we'll set it to a 4/4 time and we'll lose all the hoity-toity trappings and just make it fun.
Yeah. Speaking of fun, The Dark Path.
All right. Well, do I go with an obvious one or a hot take? Which one would you guys rather see?
Whichever tickles your fancy.
All right.
You have the floor.
We'll go with the hot take here. So this one is actually not really a metal choice, but I think a lot of people who are into dungeon synth are into metal. And surprisingly, Glenn Danzig did dungeon synth a full year before Mortis invented the genre. So I'm throwing up Black Aria by Glenn Danzig as being ahead of its time. When this thing came out, nobody cared about it. Nobody gave two craps about ambient music, neoclassical, and the metal world. And it wasn't really until Mortis came out and really took off with all of that kind of stuff that a bunch of metalheads were cool with listening to that kind of music. Well, Danzig did it a full year before Mortis had his first album out. So that's why I'm going to throw up some Black Aria.
Sweet. That's a good. I never would have thought of that. Never. Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah, that's a nice call.
Like, this album isn't really dungeon synth either. It's definitely much closer to the neoclassical ambient side of things. But there are certain tracks on this thing that sound very much like what you hear from Mortis or from Thangandodrim or whatever other guy you want to throw out there as a name. So, you know, there's definitely some leanings, some beginnings right here. And Glenn Danzig, who would have thought? So,
no, that's a great pick, Matt. I always liked that album. I always wished it was longer.
Yeah, it's only 28 minutes long, which is crazy. But when you listen to it, like, it doesn't really feel like it's only 28 minutes long either. It feels like a full album, and then you're like, oh shit, it's only been a half hour, and then you listen to it again, and it's so good. It's such a good album too for those feelings that you get from dungeon synth and neoclassical. I mean, this hits every single note. So if you are a dungeon synth fan and you have never bothered with Black Aria by Glenn Danzig, you're screwing up in life, buddy.
Make a change.
Make a change.
Review your choices. Good deal. Okay, let's pick this one. I picked Elegy by Amorphis. I remember when this came out, it was like tail end of 95 or early in 96, and the band had gotten some success with the previous album, Tales from the Thousand Lakes. It was really good, and it had a few little progressive leanings here and there. It got a lot of positive press about drawing on some folklore and stuff for lyrical inspiration, but it still overall had a lot of death metal structures to it. But then this came out, and it sounds nothing like the previous album. They went with a more, towards cleaner vocals, very heavily influenced, 70s prog structures and elements getting worked in. And nobody was doing that at the time. Again, these days, everybody and their mother's dog's band does that. They just mishmash every style they can think of together and call it, a new little subgenre. Nobody was doing that kind of stuff right there in the mid 90s. We were very much in the middle of black metal taking off and all the Relapse and Nuclear Blast bands doing great. And Amorphis just did this weird left turn back into the 70s for inspiration, and it worked really good. It was kind of a big chance for them to take. They'd been building momentum over their previous albums and had gotten a lot of acclaim, and it wouldn't have taken much for people to really shit all over this album because it was such a different change in style, but it actually had really positive reviews. I got this album right before having to go do like 6 weeks of field work out in New Mexico and Colorado for geologic mapping. And so I quickly got it, burned it to a cassette because I was just taking a Walkman with me. And so me and my buddies just played that tape constantly. And all of them were just like, holy cow, is that same band that you were playing, the Thousand Lakes album by? They're like, doesn't sound at all like them. They're like, no, it doesn't. They're like, but it's really cool. And one of them just texted me about this last week. He's like, yeah, I still play that Elegy album all the fucking time. I just never get tired of that album. It's so, kind of different. Lots of bands would do that kind of thing later, but Amorphis was one of the first ones I knew of that really took a chance and started working a lot of those other elements back into an album and really made it work. So that's my next pick is Elegy.
Remember when that album came out, I got it as a promo. I told you the story, Alan, and I was all excited for it. I really loved the first two Amorphis albums. They had a very unique death metal style, especially the first album. I mean, it was just very unique. Death metal with very dark, polluted vocals, and I just loved that style so much. I got that, put it in, and I laughed, and I laughed, and I laughed. I'm like, this is fucking garbage. And was considering throwing it in the garbage, which I've done a few times in the past. And a couple days later, I put it on again and listened to it 3 times because I had to review it. And the songs are so catchy. It's instant, total change of heart on that. And it's quite amazing. Like you said, it is quite amazing how they reinvented themselves completely when they really didn't need to. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. They were doing fine.
They were doing fine.
But that was at that weird time too in the 90s where a lot of extreme metal bands were changing it up like that. Like they were drastically making a right turn on their sound, and they were one of the many that were doing that, I think.
Yeah, somebody just mentioned in the comments Therion started going off, in their classical direction very fast. Tiamat, started going in very different sonic directions around that time.
Morgoth changed their sound. I mean, there's so many bands. Desultory changed their sound.
Yep. Oh, they changed for the worst too. That Swallow the Snake album was fucking garbage.
It's awful.
They should have spit instead of swallowed.
Oh no, you didn't.
Oh, yes, I did.
All right, I'm gonna pull this out because I don't want this to fall on the floor. Hellhammer, Apocalyptic Raids. This is one of those albums that I think was largely disliked, especially by the metal press at the time. But can trace it back. It very much lays the groundwork for both the death metal and black metal genres. And once again, they're kind of taking cues from Venom here with the theatrics and the metal studs and Satan look. And honestly, if you strip it down, this band really wasn't that great. But what they lacked in technical prowess, they made up for in charm. And the very simplicity of it made the songs very catchy. And it kind of sounded like it came from a place that no one had really unearthed before, which is very cool. And when you read, Tom talk about his influences, it's like, Angel Witch and all this other stuff. This sounds about as far away from Angel Witch as you can imagine. So it's really interesting to hear what influences a band when it's so completely 180 degree shift from what influenced them. But, everybody hears music differently and process it differently. And, their level of talent, that's how it translated. And, you got this album, which today, it might have been relatively maligned back in the day. Nowadays, it's seen very favorably by most metalheads, that got into death metal and black metal. They, Celtic Frost, of course, but that came from somewhere and it all started here. So that's it. Hellhammer. And Mr. Matt is back.
All right. Well, I'm going to go with an obvious one here. And this is one that I didn't even really think of as being ahead of its time until everybody said that it was ahead of its time. And Slaughter of the Soul at the Gates. And I say that because, when this album came out, I loved it. I was a huge fan of it. They broke up right after this album. And that was pretty much it for a while from At the Gates. But between the time of where At the Gates broke up and when they got back together, there was that whole slew of deathcore that was getting popular. And I didn't give a flying fuck about anything having to do with deathcore. So I never listened to much of it. I heard a little bit of it here and there, but I was like, yeah, that's not my thing. But everybody always said like this was the main influence on that entire genre. I never really pieced that together until I sat down and listened to something, and I was like, oh yeah, that definitely sounds like Slaughter of the Soul by At the Gates. But it wasn't really my thing, and I've never really understood why. Like, I don't like deathcore at all, but this album is just the memories of jamming this when I was in high school. Maybe that's why. Just the nostalgia of this one. But yeah, this was good 20 years ahead of their time, 15 years ahead of their time. So.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also missed the whole rise of the whole deathcore scene when it first came around. So it never occurred to me that album had such an influence on it either until much later when people were always citing it as a reference. I'm just like, I guess, yeah, okay.
Yeah, and really, when you go and listen to it, it's like it doesn't sound exactly like that album, but you hear hints of it throughout their songs, and like, oh, that breakdown is totally ATG, or that little vocal thing, like, okay, that's totally Limburg right there. So, definitely an influence on an entire genre, and therefore ahead of its time.
Okay, that means it is Alan's turn.
Okay. Let's do this one. We'll go. First off, big shout out to whoever mentioned Screaming Jay Hawkins in the comments a few minutes ago, because, crazy, spooky antics and theatrics go way, way back. And so following along those lines, another band that did that kind of ahead of its time was Death SS out of Italy. With Death SS, they never got much attention early on and still haven't to some extent, but they were, again, very influenced by Alice Cooper, horror movies, and trying to turn that all into again, these characters that they were each had their own horror movie character, movie monster they dressed up in, and they were simply identified this way as wolf and mummy and such, and going for what was a pretty extreme sounding style of music for that day and age, just being like latest 70s, earliest 1980s. It's just that they were in Italy, they never were on a big label or anything, so they didn't get much exposure, but over time they really became one of those cult bands that people latched onto, with Paul Chain going in different directions, and then Steve Sylvester coming back with different lineups. This one has a lot of the early songs, but it's a much later lineup that's present, redoing them. But Death SS were very much ahead of their time. If they'd come along a little later and maybe in a market where they'd had more exposure, they probably would have been extremely popular. But the late 70s, small band in Italy, it was just the wrong place and the wrong time for them to get noticed and really get the momentum and gain some traction that they deserved.
Yeah, I've never heard that band before, and that looks like it could be a Christian Death album almost.
Yeah, My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult and Christian Death, all of that early 80s goth rock can kind of build from that. Death SS was harsher sounding than a lot of that stuff, but you could see where those bands could have listened to it and enjoyed it and gotten some ideas from them, and they just made it into a little bit more of a melodic style of music, taking those rough edges off of it.
Hey, I'm gonna have to check them out. I've always seen that name, but I've never gotten around to listening to them. So,
yeah, definitely kind of don't buy blind. You kind of want to look at the discography and think about what you want to hear. They've gone through a lot of permutations. As you get more and more recent, they get more of an industrial sound, which isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing. It just won't sound anything at all like what the very early material sounded like. Some of their late 80s, early 90s stuff has a more traditional metal structure to it. So, yeah, it can vary a lot depending on what album you end up picking up. All right, Marty, I think we're back over to you then.
You're on mute, by the way, Marty. You're still on mute. There we
go. I say shout out to Hellhammer from Mayhem for making an appearance on the cover of that Death SS album. What am I doing here? This. Okay, next up, I'm going to jump on this band before Matt does. Paradise Lost, Gothic.
I didn't pick that one, and I was that close.
Yes.
That's great. That's 3 so far you got me on.
Paradise Lost certainly got a lot crazier and more stylistically adventurous as they progressed. But the blueprints for that stylistic freedom, I think, starts here on Gothic. It's a very transitional album where they maintain their deathy doom, very English sounding origins and start to expand into very Gothic territories. Nick Holmes, he maintains mostly a death vocal for the whole thing. He does, for sure. But the music itself gets a lot more melodic. The songs get a little more airy. There's a lot more room for other elements to seep in. And there's even a song on here that is no metal at all, And I think, after this, they kind of got a little bit, Nick kind of adopted.
Be careful now.
No, I'm not going to say anything bad. Nick adopted more of a Metallica, James Hetfield vocal style, leaving the gruff screams behind. But
for sure.
But it allowed them to do songs or albums like Draconian Times and 1 Second that were Draconian Times is just an amazingly well-written album, very Gothic metal influenced, whereas 1 Second goes very poppy. And from there, they, go on a whole whacked out journey that, people that love the band stuck with them for the whole time. For me, I'm kind of piecemeal with Paradise Lost catalog, but before finally spinning back around to where they started on the last few albums. I mean, these guys were very influential, and I really don't think they get as much respect for that. Maybe they do. I mean, they're pretty huge in Europe. I understand that, but when this came out, I don't really think people knew what they were hearing. I think they just took it as a kind of a weird death metal-ish album. I don't think they really realized that this would be the blueprint for a very whacked out discography as they move forward, as they try to reinvent themselves, it seems.
Their discography isn't as whacked out as people think it is. I mean, they really, if you look at it, like 1 Second is very poppy, and then they've got 3 albums after that that are kind of in that same sphere, but everything they've done since then has all been back to Death Doom. I mean,
is it? Yeah. See, I didn't jump back on until 3 albums ago.
Yeah,
I missed that Host album. I missed a couple in the middle.
Those are the only 3. It's Host and those 2 after it, and then they did a self-titled, and everything from the self-titled up to today has been back to Death Doom. So I mean, they really only have a little blip on the map for the weird stuff, but they seem to be kind of poisoned by that period. Like, a lot of people jumped off the boat and never came back, which is a shame, because they have a lot of great albums if you don't like pop music too. So
right. Well, hats off to them for being fearless, for trying something so bold as that. For where they came from, to put out a pop record or an industrial record is quite a shift.
Yeah. It's always interesting to me how with those first 3 Death Doom peaceful bands out of the UK that they all did such very different things. Paradise Lost went in the Gothic direction and pop and such, and Anathema of course went way off into post-rock territory. And My Dying Bride tried the one experimental album, but then came right back to the Death Doom style very quickly. It just always interests me that they those 3 bands started out around the same time and kind of in the same territory musically, but then followed very, very different trajectories through their career.
Right. And we're going to Matt.
All right. Well, I'm going to go with Fallen Angel of Doom by Blasphemy. This record is a piece of shit and I hate it, but it is totally responsible for the birth of war metal. And I could have just as easily have picked some Beharit, but I went with Blasphemy because all Blasphemy sounds the same, but Beharit at least has some electronic albums mixed in there, which have nothing to do with war metal. But war metal pretty much bows down and sucks this demon's cock on a daily basis. So
pretty much
head of its time for sure right here. I don't know what year off the top of my head that this came out in, but I know it was way before war metal was a thing. So had to make fun of Blasphemy just a little bit.
That's one of those bands. I mean, are they technically still together? I mean, they're the least prolific band ever.
Yeah, they are. They can't tour because some of the members of the band have criminal records. Just as one does when you're in metal, you got to have just a little bit of a criminal record.
Yeah.
But they can't tour anywhere outside of Canada, so they play festivals, and that's about it in Canada. There's one festival that they played at, I want to say in 2019, right before all the shit hit the fan. But yeah, they definitely are still together. They're just not very prolific.
Well, they've got 2 albums in their history. I mean, if they got nothing else going on, write another fucking album.
But there's so many other bands out there that are recording Blasphemy albums, and they all sound exactly like Blasphemy. So do they need to? Do they need to be blasphemic revenge? I mean, do they really need to do that? So
no. Hi, Alan.
Hey, back to me. All right. Eeny, meeny, miny. Oh, yeah, I want to talk about this one. I picked Sad Wings of Destiny by Judas Priest. This came out in 1976, and it really is a blueprint for what the future of heavy metal was going to be like. Priest, really you got on that twin guitar attack style, and they just made it sound sharper and, for lack of a better descriptor, more metallic than anybody else was doing in the mid 70s. You had a few other bands that were following kind of in the style. Things like Virgin Killer came out that year. UFO was hitting their stride. But you listen to those bands and albums, and you have no problem thinking like, yes, this is a 70s metal / hard rock band. But you go back and listen to Sad Wings, and just with like a band could record the song Tyrant today, and it would not sound the least bit out of place in the modern heavy metal landscape. It's not true of every song on here. There are some that, have different sounds and styles to them. But, I mean, you've got Tyrant, you've got Genocide, you've got Island of Domination, you've got Deceiver. This was what the new wave of British heavy metal was going to do. It would just take them another 3 years to catch up to what Judas Priest had already figured out. And I've seen in interviews that a lot of these songs were actually ready and could have gone on Rock-a-Rolla 2 years even earlier. But there were a lot of debacles in the studio and issues with the producer and such on that album. And so things like Tyrant didn't make it on that album. But yeah, hearing these in 76 had to be just kind of mind-blowing. And the thought that they had those songs and could have actually put them out in 74 is even crazier. So this is one of those albums I just love. I can go back and whenever I take this off the shelf, I'm going to play it for about a week before I put it back on the shelf.
It's one of my favorite albums of all time.
One of the early blueprints for heavy metal. I mean, one of the several bands for sure.
It really does show that what heavy metal was going to be like in the 1980s, and this is 1976. They really did presage where heavy metal was going to end up at.
And it's me, huh?
That's it. That's all I got.
Well, this was kind of a one and done for Mayhem, but we're going to go with Grand Declaration of War.
Oh, I thought you'd pick it.
Good choice.
This album, when it came out, people either loved it or they hated it. And I was in the hate it department. And it took a lot of years and convincing by a couple friends. Zoller, if you're watching, hey, what's up? And now I listen, whenever I grab for Mayhem, oddly enough, it's usually this album. I don't know what it is. I'm not a big fan of Maniac's screeching vocal style. I always thought Attila was, this is also a hot take. I think Attila was the singer that, he's the one for me in Mayhem. Dead is fine, but I think Attila had more style and charisma. Maniac, his screeching, it fit the style of music it was, but it just seemed unhinged and out of step with the music sometimes. And on here, it doesn't bother me as much. It seems to fit within the weird militaristic, there's like industrial militaristic influences mixed in with some really strange black metal that Blasphemer would lay down and kind of perfected after this. I mean, his riffs got weirder and weirder after this album. But this album, they never really revisited this level of craziness other than maybe the Ordo Ad Chaos, which...
Not even close.
No, it's kind of... I think the metal end of that album is a little bit like this, but it has no electronics to it.
Yeah.
This is just a very strange album. It appeals to my industrial side. It appeals to the weirdness that I reach for every once in a great while. And maybe I'm reaching for this more because I'm sick of De Mysterious. I've heard it so many fucking times in my life that this album just, it seems fresh every time I put it on. And I guess that's a sign of a band that's ahead of its time. I don't know how old this album is at this point, but it's old.
It's their most interesting. It's their most avant-garde album that they've ever done. So
it was recorded in 99, 2000. So this album's 21 years old at this point, but it was a bold choice in a time where black metal was, maybe the main impact of black metal was petering out a bit. So they, bands were starting to, especially the Norwegian scene, they were going either weird turbo death metal or they were going more electronic, like maybe this did, instead of maintaining a black metal purity. But this was a very adventurous album for a band that I honestly I didn't see this coming. I mean, who would have thought that band, that group of musicians would come up with this? It's pretty interesting.
Have you heard the remixed version of that album that came out a year or two ago?
I have not. I heard it's pretty good.
It's good. They pretty much fixed the sound levels for everything on it, for everything except for Maniac's vocals. Maniac apparently was adamant with the band and the record label that they leave his vocals alone. He was like, my vocals were perfect. Don't touch them. Don't do anything to it. So they adjusted the levels for everything else, and you can really hear the bass a lot more on it. With the bass pumped up on that album, it really makes it sound even more interesting in a way. So definitely check it out, man. It's worth a listen. Definitely worth a listen.
Yeah, that's a good choice, Marty. It's definitely their most ambitious record, and it really at that point, with that record, Mayhem was still demonstrating that they were still at the very forefront of what black metal was going to be. They were still kind of leading the way and trying out new things. And after subsequent releases, they kind of lost that. Other bands kind of took the lead instead. But yeah, with that album, they still showed that we're still at the top of this genre, and we can still go in different directions and make it work really, really well.
Yeah,
I like some of the later albums, but by the time like Ordo Ad Chaos, you feel like, yeah, didn't Deathspell Omega do something like this a couple of years ago? Maybe a little bit.
That's a fair point. I really like Ordo Ad Chaos, but the production,
I do too.
The production on that album is so
weird.
muddy. It's so weird and muddy.
Yeah,
it's just hard to. If it had a better production, I think that would have stood a lot stronger.
I think I heard that Blasphemer demanded from Hellhammer that there was not going to be any triggers used on that album.
Huh.
So apparently that's an organic drum sound. I don't know.
I don't know. It does have this very weird, murky, gauzy kind of production that I kind of like it, but it does make for a hard listen sometimes.
It's very swampy. It feels very swampy,
which is kind of feeds the theme of the album.
Yeah. It does.
It's very much a Blasphemer and Attila album. I mean, they really shine on that.
I really like everything that Mayhem did from Wolfslayer Abyss up to even the new album. I mean, this second half of their career has been better than the first. I don't care what you say about Dead and Euronymous and all of that stuff. Like, that stuff is great, but the second half of Mayhem is just as interesting and just as good. And I find myself listening to that stuff a lot more just because, I mean, how many more times do you need to hear Life Eternal and Freezing Moon? I mean, do you not have those songs just memory burned at this point?
Yeah, I love that album. It's influential as hell, but yeah, I mean, I've heard it so many times.
Yeah, like why? I mean, listen to Demon instead. Listen to something else.
I have not heard that album yet. I have not heard that yet.
I mean, it's D Mysteries Part 2, and it's because they toured that fucking album for like 4 years straight, so they didn't know how to write anything else because that's all they were playing for festival after festival, tour after tour, just D Mysteries nonstop. So that's why Demon sounds like D Mysteries Part 2, but it's good. It is good. So.
Speaking of good,
all right. Well, we're
good crap, everybody.
Well, just for that, I'm going to pull up the album. In my opinion alone, is responsible for not only groove metal being a thing and for new metal being a thing. The Real Thing by Faith No More. 1989 is when this came out, and was groove metal really even a thing before this? Was mixing rap and metal together a thing before this? Even though rap and metal mixed together for only one song on this thing, I mean, just a few years later, that's all was on radio and TV for a while. And a lot of people credit that to the song Epic off of this album. So much so that Mike Patton used to always say, I accept no responsibility for new metal, even though it's totally his fault. So, this album is great. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of any of that groovy stuff, but this was, one of the most popular bands that was doing that style. There may have been others playing around with the bass heavy kind of funky style with metal, but Faith No More were the ones that were on TV, and no one else on MTV was really sounding like this at that time, not in 1989. So that's why I'm going to throw up a little Faith No More.
I saw him on that tour.
That's a pretty good choice. Yeah, that video got played forever. It was a big deal. There's all the controversy about it too, with the exploding fishbowl at the end, and oh my God, did they hurt the fish? And
they killed the goldfish.
Yeah, that was actually a concern people had at the time, that they had actually, there was a cruelty against animals kind of petition.
Okay, the baby Jesus will make more goldfish.
And the only people are mentioning Anthrax and Bring the Noise and stuff like that in the comments, and that's a very fair point. But that's a collaboration in a way, like what they were doing with that. So I don't know if I really consider that being a true milestone for creating groove metal. That's definitely more of an influence on the rap rock, but as far as the groovy, bass heavy stuff that bands like Infectious Grooves and then Pantera and Exorder and all that kind of stuff, I think Faith No More deserves a tip of the hat for being ahead of their time.
Someone mentioned
maybe they weren't the first, but they were ahead of their time. So.
Somebody mentioned Prong, and that would be another one that would fall in there close as well. Prong, I think, hit maybe a year or so later. I want to say it was more like 91, maybe, but close.
Snap your fingers, snap your neck. Snap your fingers, snap your neck. Most annoying song in the world.
Unconditionally.
All right, Alan.
Okay. Let's do this one. Not necessarily this album, but this band, Kyuss, really took doom metal trappings and took it in a very different direction, incorporating all the what would come to be called desert rock and stoner stuff, making it very sort of trippy, and doing it pretty early. Doom metal was not exactly at its zenith in the earliest 90s to begin with, so this wasn't a popular style that people were experimenting a lot with. Bands that were trying to do doom metal stuff, a lot of it was more traditional in structure, and they just were getting no attention. And Kyuss was just over here doing their own thing, and it worked really well. And it was a band I did not get into at the time. I'd never heard them. Nobody I hung around with listened to them, so I knew nothing about the band until a few years later, probably around maybe around the time Sky Valley came out is when they finally got on my radar.
That's a perfect riff album. Sky Valley, there isn't a bad riff on that album. It's all good.
I go back and forth on whether I like Sky Valley more or this one, Blues for the Red Sun, more. But just had their very own unique sound. And of course, again, 10 years down the road, you'd have, tons of bands doing stuff influenced by this and sounding kind of like this and borrowing from this. But in the early and mid 90s, having a band doing this kind of doomy, groovy, trippy stuff was really, really different. So I think Kyuss was very much ahead of their time.
Have you ever seen that documentary where they talk about that very early desert rock scene in California, where like they would just go out into the desert with extension cords and hook up a bunch of PAs, and they would set up a quick stage and play, and they would play until the sand just compacted all of those speakers and they couldn't play anymore. And that's pretty much how desert rock in California got started, that whole scene, because it was just a bunch of bored desert kids with nothing else to do. And they had nowhere to play because they're in the middle of the flipping desert. So they just went out into the desert and had their own concerts. And apparently that whole scene kind of fell apart because a big criminal element started to take it over. People bringing guns and knives to the shows, and they started to get kind of violent. So that was the end of that. But
no, I haven't seen that. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of it, but I think if you just go to YouTube and type in stoner rock doc or desert rock documentary, it'll pop it up. And there's another one called Such Hawks, Such Sounds, I think, and that's a really good one too, about that whole desert rock scene.
Such Hawks, Pat said. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, there's a couple of different ones, but the Such Hawks, Such Sounds one is good. But there's another one, a newer one that's on YouTube that I saw not too long ago. That's worth a watch. So
okay, I'll keep an eye out for it.
Okay, I guess I'm up next. Go ahead, Alan.
I'm just going to run and grab a beer. I'll be back in 30 seconds.
Right on. Well, next up for me is a Voivod, War and Pain. I wouldn't necessarily say that this album was their most groundbreaking, but it is a very raw take on Venom. They're very strange. Tunings of Piggy really opened up a whole different level of sci-fi worship. And I don't know, these guys were ahead of their time for a lot of reasons. And they're strange. I mean, especially, on this album, I think a lot of people overlook this album, but it, even being probably one of the more normal sounding albums in their catalog for the time that it came out, is still the tunings and the presentation, all of it has a very strange presentation, I should say. And
do you think that one's more ahead of its time than like Killing Technology or Dimension Hatros?
No, but it lays the blueprint for that. Yeah. I mean, they could have went either way. They could have maintained this style and just kind of been, kind of a knuckle dragging band with some weird sci-fi tendencies, both musically and visually, but they really amped it up, got a little more proggy. I mean, Piggy realizes guitar style a lot more as this went on, and the chords got stranger and the tunings. I mean, his tuning always kind of maintained, but the chords were very strange. Dimension Hatros is one of my all-time favorite albums, hands down, without a doubt. But sure. I mean, Voivod, they were a unique anomaly on the metal world for sure. And, attribute it to their location in Canada. I don't know. Maybe they're isolated from the rest and it forced them to come up with their own sort of sound. But a
big chunk of it too, Piggy was all completely self-taught. Like he learned how to play guitar himself. And because of that, he never really learned anything that had anything to do with music theory or proper riff structure. So that's why their songs are so off kilter, but it's great. Like it works. But I think that's also why a lot of people just don't like Voivod at all.
Yeah.
Those people are wrong. They're living their lives incorrectly, but yes.
People were saying they wonder why Alan did. You thought I'd pick Killing. There are more adventurous, groundbreaking albums in their catalog, but it started here, and this band has always been comfortable in their own skin, even though the skin might be green colored. But
that may just be ignorance on my part. Voivod, I don't know their catalog as well as I should. They're always on my list of bands to dig deeper into, and they just never quite get through it all. It's not that I don't like them. I just
we have much to discuss with you after the stream is done. I mean,
I understand. I just lost 5 of my true metal street cred points. So I'll try
you didn't lose any points. You didn't lose any points. It's just Marty and I need to teach you a few things after the stream, and everything's going to be okay from here on out. Everything's going to be okay, Alan.
Okay, guys. If I don't post any videos for a few weeks, they drug me out in the desert. I'm there, in a sack full of sand up next to some old rusty speakers and some cables.
I fully expect you to do a full deep dive on Voivod, in about a month's time now. So, starting after this stream,
I got one or two projects ahead. I will get to them one day. I will. I have albums.
We're going to train you up there, son.
We'll work on it.
I've got more than 10. If people still want us to ramble on after this, we could probably ramble on after we do 10. I've got plenty.
Sure.
Anyway.
I don't have many more than 10, but I've got a few more. I think we're only just at 6 or 7 so far.
About yeah.
Does anyone?
I've still got at least 4 or 5 sitting here. So
we've got
we're good.
I've done 6. So Alan is starting his 7th.
No, right. Matt's starting his 7th.
Well, Matt is.
Oh, is it me? Yeah. Oh shit! All right. Well, let's pick another hot take because that's the way the dark path rolls around here. Who invented slam metal? Suffocation. Everybody knows this. Now, Pierce from Within, I wouldn't say is the album that did that. I would say probably Effigy of the Forgotten, maybe, but I don't own that album. But I definitely wanted to throw Suffocation out there as being a little bit ahead of their time just because they had one breakdown and one song that influenced an entire genre of pig fucking awful metal. So So as much as people love Suffocation, and I love Suffocation too, I'm not talking shit about Suffocation, but Slam is their fault, and they need to take a knee for that, I think.
That's probably my favorite album by them too. So
yeah,
good.
Legion of Inveracity, that's the song I'm thinking of. That song right there. It's all that's fault, man.
Okay, now I guess we're back to me. All right, check out. Only vinyl one I pulled off the shelf. Warlord,
Great,
Deliver Us.
Great.
Very early U.S. metal period for 80s stuff, and very different from what other folks were doing at the time. More melodic, more keyboard driven, but more classically leaning in the guitar work. Really strong vocals, great song structures and songwriting. All for a band that was essentially a studio project. Was always the crazy thing with them, that they didn't record a lot of material because they weren't really fully functional active band. But this album also just withstands the test of time so well. It really it's influenced so many bands later on in power metal scenes, traditional metal scenes, and you could release this today and people would be like, yeah, that probably came out last year. Is that some is that one of those new wave of traditional metal bands? It's like, no, this is from 1983, and be like, oh, okay. So yeah, way ahead of their time. Great band, great stuff.
Well, if I need to teach you about Voivod, you need to teach me about Warlord, because I'm not that familiar with those guys. I know I've heard some of their stuff, but I don't remember any of it. So.
We'll set up a cultural exchange program and get each other up to speed.
And the cool thing about that album is it's very much a product of its time. It's got the same atmosphere as like that early Fates Warning. They shared a drummer too, didn't they?
Zonder went on to Fates Warning. Yep. Because Thunderchild on this one. The another one too. The vocalist, I believe, had a album from like a hard rock band in the late 70s that's really good and has some really epic late 70s hard rock metal stuff on it. But they had some very strong musicians in there, and of course the guitarist too, going on and doing all the Lordian Guard material later on.
I guess I'm up next. I'm going to pick one that. All right, Watchtower, Controlled and Resistance. This is basically capitalizing on traditional metal, adopting a tech thrash element, and coming out on Noise Records during a time where thrash was king. I mean, these guys were a techie transitional band. Very much thrash, crazy technical stuff that maintained a level of catchiness, so the songs didn't seem foreign. And what was the guy's name? Alan, Tecchio. Didn't he go on to be in Hades as well? I believe so. The New York based band or Jersey based band Hades. But
let me check. I don't remember.
This is the only Watchtower I own. I know they've got another one here or there, but I always found that this album sat pretty unique for that. This came out in '89, which was an era where bands like Halloween were starting to take off. European power metal was kind of being born at that point, and it would soon infect all the continents. But these guys were very unique. They've got the Ron Jarzembek, who is an insanely crazy guitar player, and his brother Bobby Jarzembek is an amazing drummer, who also is just as technically proficient. But this is a great band. This was a great album. A little strange. Alan Tecchio's voice was a little glam metal style, but I don't know. I dig it. I think this is good and kind of ahead of its time at the time.
Yep. And that was their second album, and they were still ahead of their time.
Yeah.
Because Energetic Disassembly is also it was one I almost put on my list to talk about, because Energetic Disassembly was so weird for its day and age too.
But when did that come out? If this came out in '89, that must have been 87, 88?
I think it was a little earlier than that. I think there's a bigger gap. Let me check real quick. I want to say it was more like 86. Energetic Disassembly was 85.
Holy shit! I mean, that's
there's a 4-year gap between.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and because they lost their vocalist in between. They had Jason McMaster on the first album, and he went on to Dangerous Toys.
Yep.
Yep. But yeah, that's a good pick, Marty. That's one I got, in the early 90s, probably 92. And it's one that it just went completely over my head. It wasn't that I didn't like them. It was just like, I don't understand what I'm listening to. And I'm smart enough to admit I'm dumb enough that I just don't get this.
Yep. It's a grower for sure. I mean, I really had to work at it. I got it during a time where you got maybe 3 tapes a month, and what you bought, you better live and die by. And it made me like a lot of stuff I normally nowadays would be listened to once and go, meh. But, and what's not to like? It's so complex. It's so rhythmically complex and musically complex with those soaring vocals over the top, trying to tie it all together. It's a pretty interesting mix. And that puts Mr. Matt back in the captain's chair.
Oh, that's not Matt. Oh, there he is. All right. Well, I mentioned pig fucking in the last one that I showed, so we gotta show the originators of the pig fucking vocals.
Speaking of pig fucking the Dark Path, everyone.
Yeah, a little Demilich Nespithe here. And I picked this one because this was an album where it came out. It was like so under the radar. Nobody knew what the hell this was. And it wasn't really discovered until much, much later. And it really only got discovered when all of that slammy pig fucking vocal type stuff came out. And people went back and were listing this as a major influence on a lot of stuff. And it just had a whole swell of people just rediscovering this album. So that's why I say this one is definitely ahead of its time. I mean, this originally came out on Necrophagia Records, which is mainly known for black metal, but they're the ones who put this out first. So, great album though. As much as I make fun of pig fucking, I gotta say the vocals on this thing are just obscenely ridiculous. And I love this album so much. It's such a fun album. So
he's saying like the Predator in the movie The Predator.
Yeah.
Let me hit a few comments up here. Sorry, everybody. I'm falling behind. It's hard to maintain a conversation and moderate at the same time.
That's a good call out by Pat with Confessor. Yeah. That was a very different kind of band that was out of time.
Yeah, I was okay. I figured that brain cell that held that information about Hades hadn't died yet.
Yep. Good call.
Okay, and next up is Mr. Allen.
Okay, I've shown this off recently, but it fits for this theme as well, so we'll show it again. Nobody was doing Viking metal in 1990 except this guy, and it's still the best example of that style that I've ever come across.
Agreed.
Such a change in direction. And yeah, you can say he was doing it, somewhat on the previous album, but the previous album, I felt like he was really finding his footing on how he wanted to go in that direction. And I think after, he worked out the kinks, he nailed it on this one, that, it has this big epic sweep. You really get lost in the storytelling of this album, and just, it's this slow, it's kind of got this, hypnotic thing. So different from what he was doing a few years earlier as well. But yeah, I didn't hear this until probably about 96, 97 when I came across it. And even then it was like, this is really, really unique even then. And by then you had other bands starting to, work with the Viking metal formula, but they didn't do it like this. Nobody does it like this. Ahead of its time, timeless, still a classic. This is the one I pick. You can pick lots of Bathory albums as being hugely influential on stuff that came later, but just, again, the change in style and how this one just takes that big left turn and makes it work so well compared to what they had been doing and having success with. This is the one I picked for tonight's topic.
And really, if you think about it, he achieves all this while not being the world's best singer, which is even more evident on Twilight of the Gods, where his vocals really are pretty rough, but it's the charm and conviction of it that holds it all together. For me, Blood on Ice, I mean, yeah, Hammerheart, I loved it when it came out, but Blood on Ice for me is perfecting that Viking metal style, and the songs like The Wood Woman in the Lake, holy shit, are two like the best songs he ever wrote, as far as I'm concerned. So
Oh, yeah.
triumphant. Just soaring choruses, just fucking awesome.
And I really like those Nordland albums that he did too. I mean, those are fantastic.
They are fantastic. He went out on a high note, man. He went out on a high note.
Good. So good.
Yeah. Interesting note on Blood on Ice. My, at the time, girlfriend got that album before I did. I think she got it while I was out doing field work for a while on geology, and she had gotten it. And like, so when I got back out of the field like a month later, she's just like, I've got something you need to hear, and you do not know this one. And I'm just like, what is it? And she showed it to me. It's just like, okay, Bathory, I know Bathory. She's like, oh, I don't think you know this one. I was like, what the hell is that? And just like, holy shit, that's a good, you found a good one.
Yeah. And speaking of finding a good one, next up, Afflicted, Prodigal Sun. This basically, these guys were kind of a one and done. I don't think they had any albums after this, did they? Memory does not serve. If so, I don't have them. But basically, they took the exploding Swedish death metal style and added a psychedelic 70s aura to it. The riffs got really strange. They even had flowery shirts and tie-dye on to drive the point home. But this is just a very strange, the riffs are atypical, which for the time, the Swedish death metal style has got a lot of punk in it, simplistic punk riffs, given the HM2 metal distortion treatment. But this album was a little more refined, a little fancier around the edges, but a very good album. This was kind of a deep dive of pick. I'm kind of stretching it with this one, but I always kind of thought these guys were a little bit ahead of their time. It would have been interesting to hear how they cultivated this conglomeration of styles moving forward, but they left a good album.
Someone in the comments, Human Falafel, says they did a second album.
I did not know that.
In 95, but I think he said it's a power metal album. Let me go back and look at the comment, or you can pull it up.
Wow.
It says did a power metal album after, and it looks like it came out in 95, so about 3 years after Prodigal Sun. So
they completely flipped the script on that.
Perhaps, yeah. I don't know. It's not. I've seen that album, but I've never heard it. Don't know.
Okay, it is Matt's turn again.
Oh boy. All right, I'm gonna go with pretty much everything that Mysticum did in the early days, and this is a collection, Lost Masters of the Universe, which is all their demos from 93 to 94, 95. And I'm picking this one because in 1993, black metal and industrial were not a thing, and that was not really done until Mysticum did it. And even though industrial black metal never really became a big, huge thing, I mean, there's a few bands here and there that have played around with those sounds, but it never became like a huge movement where there's like a huge group of bands that did that. But someone mentioned, I think the very first comment that someone posted on this stream about 3 hours before we even started, they talked about Datumsgard 666 International.
You mean this one?
Yeah, I thought about picking that one too, but I mean, this came before that, so that's why I thought this one was kind of ahead of its time. And really, 666 International, what else really sounds like that album? I mean, nothing that I can really think of. I mean, maybe that one Abigor album, Fractal Possession, sounds kind of in that vein. But as far as mixing industrial sounds with black metal, you got to give it up to Mysticum, because they were the first to really do that. And I think they kind of came across that sound accidentally. I don't think they really meant to sound like this. I think it just wound up sounding like this because of the drum machine. And from the drum machine came background synths. And those two things together just kind of create that industrial atmosphere. And you don't really hear that anywhere else. You hear it a little bit on Grand Declaration of War, here and there. So again, I say this is definitely ahead of its time, this material here.
That's a good choice. And I got to say that in the streams of Inferno, there isn't many black metal albums that sound as cold as that album does. Just the way the vocals are just acidic.
That album sounds like it was recorded in an abandoned insane asylum. Like that's exactly what that album sounds like, and nothing else sounds like that. And the only reason I picked the demos over that one is just because they're the demos. They came first, so I could have easily picked In the Streams of Inferno. But this is actually an interesting press. This is one that the band put out themselves before Peaceville licensed it from them, and they released it on their own record label, Planet Satan Revolution. It is the one only release from Planet Satan Revolution. And if you look at the CD, it's a bunch of psychedelic mushrooms that they put on there. Planet Satan Revolution. The revolution has begun. Oh my gosh, it's begun, guys. But,
never stop the madness.
That's a cool pressing.
Yeah, I bought that direct from the band. Like they had disappeared for decades, and then they got back together briefly, put out that collection, broke up again, and then they came back. 5 years ago?
They kind of sidestepped the industrial thing and went to complete EDM black metal. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, for that Planet Satan album. Yeah, it's very much more in line with these guys. I'm not gonna say they were ahead of their time doing this. That's why I didn't pick it. But Planet Satan is very much in line with what Aberum was doing. So with that EDM, take a bunch of MDMA and go fuck some people up on a dance floor kind of bullshit. So,
All right, Alan.
All right. I'm going to go kind of back to early 80s power metal and pick this one, Malmsteen's first album. Sure, you had other bands playing power metal and stuff, but Yngwie, such a huge influence on the entire European power metal scene 10 years after the fact. You had other hotshot guitarists before this, but Yngwie really did it, with the classical flourish. Eddie Van Halen, it was, the self-taught prodigy thing. And, Ritchie Blackmore, it was the classical structures and such, really slick. But, nobody sounded like Yngwie did when they played back in that time. Nowadays, yes, every other power metal band has a guitarist who, plays like that. And whether they know it or not, they're just copying what he did 40 years ago almost. Not my favorite stuff from the early 80s power metal bunches. I don't mind it. Sometimes in the mood, sometimes not. But in terms of just being way, way ahead of his time in terms of technicality, the guitar stylings of it, nobody was doing stuff like this when he was. Took a long time for all the other wannabe Yngwies to grow up and take enough guitar lessons and learn enough theory to catch up to where he was at and eventually start bands like Stradivarius and Rhapsody and then start to make their own mark.
I gotta say, I've been listening to a ton of power metal lately, and it's a daily reminder how I want to take all my guitars, chop them up, and burn them. Because I just did not study enough or play enough to ever achieve the goals that these guys have achieved. But
I was talking to one of my best friends in Atlanta today, and I told him that I've been listening to a lot of power metal lately too. And he said, "So do you feel better?" And I was like, "Yeah, actually, I do. I feel
kind of do it. It really
do." And he was like, "Yeah, because it's audio antidepressants, and that's what it's good for." And I was like, "Man, I just talked to Marty about that the other day."
Yeah. Look at band pictures, and there's at least two dudes in every band picture smiling, which is like, that just doesn't seem right. It's like whenever you take band pictures, like no one fucking smile.
Well, like when you guys, when you two were doing that video about the Halloween Skyfall track, like I can't remember who it was in the comments, but they're like I can't listen to Halloween because it's just too happy sounding. And I was like, sometimes you need a mood booster, man. The world fucking brings you down. Sometimes you need some good power metal to just feel triumphant and good and get your ass back out there and live your life. What's wrong with it? So
got to get pumped up sometimes. Yeah.
Hey, I'm not going to the gym to pump up. I'm going to listen to Halloween. That's what I'm going to do.
I'm going to oil up and get all muscular in the comfort of my own home and get
some Manowar action going. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's you just sometimes you need music that'll psych yourself up for whatever is coming up, and that kind of stuff's great for it.
Sometimes you want to just drive along, pump your fist, and do a bad falsetto sing along with some band that you have no business singing along with.
Yeah.
Which is completely opposite of what I'm going to talk about now, and that is Death Scream Bloody Gore.
Oh,
this is up.
No, that's going to bring us back to the discussion about this one
when I
showed it earlier.
Full circle.
So looked it up. This came out 3 months before Scream Bloody Gore came out. So I was right.
Yeah, but Chuck had been doing all those demos years before Necrophagia.
We're not talking about demos. We're talking about who got out the gate with a professional release first, and it was these guys.
Well, Possessed.
Chuck did it better. We're not going to argue about that.
Chuck did it way better.
Chuck did it way better.
Double dumps on fucking Necrophagia, but Possessed may have coined the term. Necrophagia may have been out a few months before this album, but this is kind of the blueprint for what a lot of death metal strove to be, and
still does.
And still does. I mean, this album will forever be in print. Forever. I mean, this is the first CD. This is one of the first CDs I ever bought too. The day I got a CD player, this disc and King Diamond's Abigail and Slayer's Show No Mercy. First 3 CDs I bought. Anyway, this album is death for me. This is the first death album I heard, so this is always going to be their best for me, just because that's where I jumped in on it with, and the songs are just so vicious and well written. I mean, all these things. Zombie Ritual. Mutilation, one of my favorite death metal songs, such a great one. Evil Dead, Baptized in Blood. This whole album is just banger after banger. Chuck's Evil Chuck, his vocals were just so grim and nasty. And blueprint for what death metal would become.
You very easily could have pulled Leprosy and said the exact same thing too, because when Leprosy came out, what else sounded like Leprosy? Like nothing sounded like Leprosy when that came out. So, all that stuff was ahead of its time.
There were other bands.
People are joking in the comments here. Oh, Possessed versus Death. Like, shut up, man. Possessed was not death metal. Come on, get real.
A lot of people say it was, but we're not going to get into that.
They came up with the term, but so what? Venom came up with black metal. Are they really black metal? Come on.
Bathory's got more to do with black metal than Venom did.
Exactly. So, I mean, Possessed is great too.
Oh, I love Possessed. I fucking love it.
Yeah.
And speaking of love, there's Alan drinking his beer.
I'm after Matt.
Oh, shit. I always skip Matt. Why is that?
I don't know.
I'm very skippable. So, all right. Here's another hot take from the Dark Path. This is just a band that I think came out a good decade too early. I think if these guys came out 10, maybe 15 years later, they would have been, a lot bigger. Not to say that Atheist wasn't big, but I think what Atheist was doing at the time that they were doing it, no one was making death metal, this spacey kind of ethereal, almost hippie death metal. No one was doing this. And I pulled Unquestionable Presence as the example, but even more so with Elements. I mean, their last album, they did this album as a contractual agreement only. They didn't even want to record this, but this is one of my favorite Atheist albums, honestly. And no one was doing death metal like this. This isn't really death metal, I wouldn't say. But back to Unquestionable. I mean, who else was sounding like this at this time? Nobody. But if they came out a decade later, they would have fit right in with all of that really spacey pseudo death metal stuff like Astronoid and all that kind of stuff. So,
yeah, good call.
That's my pick.
Yeah, that's another one. The first time I heard it, it just went completely over my head. I'm just like, I cannot digest this. It's not bad, but yeah, it's
weird. It's weird, and
it's very over my head. It was Elements was the one I first heard, and like you said, is it even death metal anymore? By that point, it's got all this weird, jazzy, different structures in it.
Yeah, and like that. Funny you say that, because that jazzy structure is something that so many tech death bands started playing with, and even there's even some black metal bands that are playing with that now, like Imperial Triumphant. Like, are they even really a black metal band, or are they a jazz fusion band that, you know, plays black metal? You know, that's an argument for another video. But yeah, all that jazzy stuff was being done by Atheist well before Gorguts and everybody else that was playing with that kind of stuff was doing it. So
yeah, when Atheist was doing that, I mean, Gorguts was on their first couple of albums, which, while good, were, you know, much more straightforward death metal in nature.
For sure.
Yeah, and Atheist was already like way over there. Like Gorgut, it's like, come on over here, Gorguts. You'll get here eventually.
Yeah. And the funny thing too about Atheist is, you know, those first 3 albums are great. I love all 3 of those first Atheist albums, but when they got back together with Jupiter, I hated that album so much. I don't know if you guys have heard Jupiter, but
I've heard it online. I don't own it.
Whew, bad. And apparently the main guy behind Atheist is like a real prima donna, thinks his shit doesn't stink type of guy. So what are you going to do?
Not buy their stuff anymore? Hi, Alan. I got you this time.
All right. Yep. I'm back in sequence. Okay. So I'm going to go a little outside of metal. And anytime this topic comes up of like albums ahead of their time, this is always my knee-jerk default answer for an album that was ahead of everything else going on at the time. It's Raw Power by Iggy and the Stooges. This is punk in 1973. This is 3 years before the Sex Pistols break big and become a thing. Nothing I've ever come across from 73 really quite sounds like this. You know, they'd already done 2 albums, but those first 2 Stooges albums, they're very true to the late 60s garage rock sound. You know, the first one's okay. It's not my favorite. Funhouse, the second one's a good album. But, you know, then, you know, they kind of fell apart, you know, took a hiatus. Iggy goes to the UK, comes back, you know, with this hotshot guitarist. And this album just does not make sense to me. I used to have sort of a running joke on a forum with some friends about aliens who traveled through time specifically to pick up albums and release them long before they were supposed to. We call them, like, you know, time traveling discography manipulators. And this was always, just the textbook example of this album has no business existing in 1973. Nobody should have been doing this in 1973. It's like looking at a picture from the Civil War and seeing somebody flying a Boeing 737 over the battlefield at Gettysburg. It just doesn't make any sense. And it's so good. It's an amazing album. It's very varied. The songs, you know, have their own identities. You can very clearly hear there's a lot of that, you know, late 50s rock and, you know, rockabilly influences here. But at the same time, it is punk. They just didn't know what to call it in 73. And it was a huge, colossal flop at the time. Nobody liked this album. Nobody bought this album. The band disintegrated quickly afterwards because nobody was interested in what they were doing. And yet it laid the groundwork for God knows how many bands that would pop up, you know, a few years down the road and into the late 70s and the post-punk scene. The Stooges were, you know, really became the godfathers of so many things. And at the time, nobody gave a shit about it. And it's this weird out of time album. That's always my default for something that was years ahead of its time.
Good call.
Yep.
Thank you.
I guess that pulls me. So yeah, I'm stretching for a couple of these. I could have, you know, pulled out Into the Pandemonium, Everybody Rants and Raves. Oh, that's such a groundbreaking album, but I have a lot of problems with that album. I think that album's a mess. I think they finally got it right on Monotheist, but so I went with Edge of Sanity. I don't know if this is really that groundbreaking, but I think during a time where, again, Swedish death metal was kind of doing its thing, it's kind of maintaining a level that had been maintained for some time. You know, he comes along with this album, Purgatory Afterglow, which has got, in the album before it, Spectral Sorrows, had the goth song, the Sisters of Mercy song on it. And, you know, it's got Black Tears, where Swano sings it completely all in a clean vocal style. mean, in a lot of ways, this is the predecessor, to Opeth. I don't know exactly where this falls. This falls in 94. This one does. When the hell did Opeth start? It had to be
About
96, 96 maybe?
95 maybe? 95,
even more so
was the
this
first
year.
one.
I mean, this Crimson, to me, is a masterpiece. I mean, it's one long song, though it's broken up into stages where it could be, multiple songs. But, more of a proggy influence infecting the Swedish death metal. Swano had a vision, and I don't think he was ever really satisfied with where this project went. I think he's happy with stuff like I interviewed him on this album, and what a super nice guy. One of the nicest guys I think I've interviewed. But he always pushing himself, and I think it's because he's got a lot of prog in his history as well as growing up. So I mean, that infected this death metal, and I think it's really cool. It set this band apart. Not a ton of people talk about Edge of Sanity. I think it's largely respected, but I don't think that it's as respected as it should have been. And if you look at,
they never had a reunion. They never really reunited, so they're kind of out of the purview in a way.
But I mean, it's albums like this that could have been the blueprint for Opeth, and then of course Opeth went on to be huge.
Right.
So I mean, I think this band was very much ahead of their time. They didn't really look back and discredit their death metal past. They just incorporated some new ideas with it, which is a very smart way of progressing. It was a slow and steady progression.
Yeah. Purgatory Afterglow is my favorite by them, and you're right. People don't talk about Edge of Sanity, and even when they do, they never talk about Purgatory Afterglow.
It's a great album.
It is a great album.
So is Unorthodox.
I kind of lean more towards Pandemonium than I do Edge of Sanity, just because I like weird shit.
Yeah,
Pandemonium is Mr. Bungle death metal style.
Pretty much, yeah.
I just love Pandemonium so much. So there's a few people in the comments talking about them too. So right on to the Pandemonium
Yeah,
fans.
It's good shit. Speaking of good shit.
So to piggyback off of your picks with Edge of Sanity, Mellow Death, early 90s, maybe Carcass was a little bit ahead of the curve with some of that stuff. 1993. Hot take I'm going to throw out there for discussion for people to yell at me for, but what other death metal band was sounding like this in 1993? This was a little bit before some of that Edge of Sanity stuff and a lot of that Swedish stuff. Carcass was already doing the melodic death metal thing before people really knew what was going on with that. And a lot of people hated them for it. Like, what the hell are you doing? What is this? What is this nonsense? But, they took the plunge, and I don't think they get a lot of credit for, playing around with those mellow death sounds that a lot of other bands, get a lot of credit for. I mean, this was 1993. It was right there with a lot of that stuff. So putting this up for consideration and debate and discussion. What say you, gentlemen?
I like the album. It was the first. No, that's not true. It was the second Carcass album, and for whatever reason, I'd heard Necrotism before when it came out, and for whatever reason, I mean, it's obviously a big stylistic shift, and it didn't faze me, and I don't really know why, because it's very noticeable. But it's just like, okay, new Carcass album. Okay, I like that way. I like the way that sounds too, and just took it from there.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. It's playing with those elements that, At the Gates is just kind of getting up and running around that time. They're still on those first two albums, which some people like, some don't, but they're looser in structure than what At the Gates would do later. And Carcass has already really tightened it up and polished it and got it up there front and center.
Yeah, like a lot of the Swedish bands get all the credit for the mellow death stuff, but I mean Carcass was doing it before a lot of that. Oh, I don't want to say before a lot of it, but I mean they were right there at the forefront with it. So
yeah, falafel. Carcass invented gore grind, invented death grind, and invented melodic death, a record.
Fair point.
For me, that album was a shock to the system. I loved Symphonies of Sickness so much and Necroticism so much. Listen to those albums so many thousands of times. that when Heartwork came out, it sounded like a different band with Jeff Walker singing. I mean, it was so slick. Yeah, I listened to it enough where I know that I could sing along with the whole album. It just seemed like for a band with the name Carcass, they should have changed the name, but I got over it. I love the album. That's my only complaint. It was, my perception of it, not necessarily what it was.
What do you think about Swan Song?
I didn't like it at all.
Didn't like it?
No.
See,
I don't mind it. I seem to like it more than
albums that everybody hated. Everybody hated Swan Song, but it kind of gets revered a little bit more today, just with the passage of time. A lot of people come back to it and they're like, actually, yeah, that's not that bad of an album. You just have to kind of look at it through a different lens, I think.
Yeah. So. I mean, it obviously wasn't as strong as Heartwork, but I liked it when it came out, and it's a lot of times when I reach for something by Carcass, I'll reach for Swan Song still. It still gets
I love the
played.
first song. I love Keep On Rotting in the Free World. That's a great song. It's like it's such a stupid pop Carcass song, but it's fun, It's really fun.
Well, we're past 10, but we're at 10, but I've got a few more. If you have a few more, Alan, you're up next. Do you want to go?
I have two more. I have my 2 honorable mentions, and then that's it for me.
I've got 3 more I can talk about. One isn't really, I just want to talk about them because they're awesome.
Yep, I got a couple more than I can shout out to you. I don't have a physical copy of this because, to be honest, I've never gotten into the album, but it has to be mentioned when this topic comes up. Into the Pandemonium, Celtic Frost. I have owned multiple copies of this album. I have spent a lot of hours of my life listening to that album, trying to get that album, and it never has really clicked. But in terms of things ahead of its time, that's got to be like on the cover of the book.
It was, yeah.
It's not that I don't like it or that I hate it or anything. It's just that I still to this day don't really get it. I like earlier Celtic Frost. I like some later Celtic Frost. Into the Pandemonium just exists in this weird place. It's not only ahead of its time. I don't think its time has even come even today. I think we're still kind of waiting for maybe it's 2041 and Into the Pandemonium makes perfect sense to everybody by then.
I love Into the Pandemonium. It's my favorite Celtic Frost album. So
fair enough.
There was the one song, Inner Sanctum, was the only one that reminded me of old Celtic Frost on there. The rest of it, I hated the whiny vocals on Mesmerized. I hated them starting off the album with Mexican Radio. I thought that was so fucking dumb. Why would they do that? Put that at the end of the album. I don't know. It's a mess.
Was this ahead of its time? Was this ahead of its time at all?
That was exactly at the right time.
That came out at the time where they were trying to do whatever they could to make money.
That was about a year after its time.
Yeah. That one was late to the party, actually. I guess that means I'm up. Is this the most groundbreaking band ever? No, but this is a band, to me, they're groundbreaking for the fact that they maintained an aesthetic. And they did a very good job at mixing turbocharged death metal, super complex but memorable death metal with interesting non-metal musical moments at the same time, whether it's keys or ancient Egyptian scales. And they did it live by means of a guitar computer or a computer that he would touch, on his feet. With his feet, he would change the patches and stuff. But I always found that no band sounded like Nile to me, and for a lot of ways they revolutionized how you could maintain atypical aesthetic within an often closed-minded genre. And Matt.
All right. Well, I'm going to go way, way back with my honorable mention here. This is not metal, so get over it, those of you who are expecting to only see metal. But I can tie it all together. And we're going to go back to the 1920s with Robert Johnson. Now, Robert Johnson is an infamous blues musician who is famous for the story of selling his soul to the devil at the crossroads, for getting, like, that's how he got his guitar talent. And, you know, that story alone is metal as fuck. So that's why Robert Johnson has to be mentioned. And beyond just that story alone, you know, what this guy did was really groundbreaking and different at the time. I mean, in the mid to late 1920s, you know, a lot of the Delta blues, they didn't sing about hanging out with Satan. They didn't sing about being chased by hounds of hell. They didn't sing about the devil convincing them to beat their wives and drink alcohol. You know, like, Robert Johnson tied all of that together. Like, there was a lot of sadness and pain in the music of blues. That's what blues music is really all about back in the day. But Robert Johnson, you know, pulled Satan into the mix. He was the only guy that was really known for singing about that topic. And, you know, he's got lyrics about, you know, me and the devil hanging out side by side, and he tells me to beat my woman until I'm satisfied. You know, those are really dark things to sing about. And at the end of the day, they're metal as hell. And one of the things I find the most fascinating about Robert Johnson is that Crossroads story isn't necessarily a Robert Johnson story. There's also another blues musician around the same time named Tommy Johnson, who that story is also accredited to. And he predates Robert Johnson by a couple of years. So you've got two blues musicians, both in the Delta blues region. Both of them have stories about selling their soul to the devil at the crossroads, but Robert Johnson is the one that gets the credit for that story in the mainstream culture. But he wasn't the only one. And I think it's because he sang about Satan a lot. So, you know, that's why he gets that tag. But if you've never listened to Robert Johnson, you're doing it wrong, man. This is really good stuff. And if you can get past the fact that it was recorded in 1926, 1927 in a little studio, and it's just a guy, you know, playing on a fiddle, you know, pay attention to the lyrics. The lyrics are dark, they're creepy, they're scary. And he's singing about really nuts stuff. And so that's my guy who's definitely ahead of his time. He was singing about what Deicide sings about today back in 1926. So boom.
That's a cool pick, Matt.
Wordvert knows what's up. Wordvert knows what's up.
Very cool pick, Matt. And yeah, just in terms of how far ahead of the time they were, it's a little new wave of British heavy metal band that did a couple of singles in the earliest 80s. It's not on this single, but on their other one, they cover Hellhound on My Trail by Robert Johnson. And so, yeah, you had, you know, metal bands very much aware of what Robert Johnson was doing and taking it and making it into a cool heavy metal song. And it fits perfectly, you know, same lyrics and everything. They just kind of, you know, amp it up a little bit instead of being an acoustic blues number. Yeah. And if you didn't know it was a cover, you probably wouldn't blink an eye and just think, oh, yeah, that's a cool new song. Oh, what do you mean it's a cover? Who covered it?
Yeah. And
what do you mean it's from 1923?
The Rolling Stones have covered songs by Robert Johnson. I mean, one of the biggest Eric Clapton songs is Sweet Home Chicago. Well, that's a Robert Johnson song, you know. And another cool thing about Robert Johnson, I'm going to go off on a rant here, but you know, when you listen to his stuff, you can kind of hear it sounds like there's two guitars being played, but it's only one guy playing it. But when you listen to it, it definitely sounds like there's another guitar player in that room. And for a long time, people were saying, well, that's the power of Robert Johnson. He's possessed by the devil. That other person playing the guitar with him is the devil. And, you know, that's since been debunked. You know, there's plenty of people on YouTube who show how he mimicked the effect of having two separate guitar sounds onto one guitar. But, you know, he was a guy that was just ahead of his time, man. He died at 27, was poisoned by a guy because he was fucking his wife. Metal as fuck. Metal as fuck.
Yep.
So,
Alan.
Yeah, I got one more I can mention. Well, I want to shout out one before I show this. There's nothing, I don't have something to show for this honorable mention because there is nothing to show. It's a German band that did 2 demos in theory. I've never seen a physical copy of them. They never did anything else. It's a band called Greenback. And credit for this one goes to someone posted a comment in the Power Metal Through the Ages video that we did a while back, Marty. And it was one of the last comments. I think it was Metal Scavenger. It's over on his page. He's got one of their demo tracks posted. It's the only track I've been able to track down by them. But he had left a comment saying, hey, you guys should check this out if you've never heard of Greenback. I went and listened to it. It's a really good German power metal track. And, it's like, yeah, this would have fit in perfectly on anything. Noise could have released this very easily around 86, 87, somewhere in there. And you look at the date on the demos, and it's like 1982. It's 2 years before Walter put out any original material on the Noise label. And it's just like, damn, if you'd asked me to guess what year this is, I would have started around 87. And I guess I would have just kept working my way backwards until you said I was correct. But I would never have guessed that it was that early. Is it the greatest song ever recorded? No. It's a good, solid German metal song. But yeah, there's some band called Greenback that I think the 2 demos only have like 4 songs total between the 2 combined. And it's classic 80s German metal a couple of years before anybody was really putting out vinyl with that kind of stuff on it. So it's interesting. I wanted to shout him out because it was a cool link that Metal Scavenger left. So shout out if he's around.
Sweet.
Last band I'll mention is a weird one. And this is a crappy bootleg, so it may not show up well. It's a death metal band called Calicia. And they did this one EP. It was on the Adipashare label, which had notoriously bad distribution and all kinds of problems. It's called Skies. I think it came out in 96, and it's got really progressive structures to it. It's still sort of meant to be a death metal vocals at heart, but the song structures are all over the place. But it works very well. It's very melodic. It's very smooth. It's sort of flying high, triumphant sounding at times. Some slightly different instrumentation worked in at times, and it's just a really interesting listen. I got it tape trading back in the late 90s and was just like, wow, this is really different sounding. And it took a long time to find out anything about the band because late 90s, Metal Archives wasn't a thing yet. You were still kind of getting the internet fleshed out a lot. But yeah, Calicia, I never heard anything else that sounded like them. And later, as death metal bands got more experimental and trying different things, you'd hear bands do stuff like this. But this was a really weird one for its time. I always liked it, and it's a pain to find.
Never heard of it.
No, nobody's ever heard of it. The funny thing was they were French, if I remember right, and they years and years later, once the internet got up and going, there was always rumor of the main guy working on another album, and he did an EP under the name Chrysalis, which is also very unique sounding, and then literally like a lifetime later, he finally put out this massive 2 CD concept record called Sibion. And it's this very long, it's kind of a space opera type story going on with, this guy becoming, it's got elements of Dune and Star Wars kind of worked into his own little story. But, even this one, it's very, very different sounding.
I need to hear that, sir.
I'll dig around. I used to have an extra copy of this. I don't think I do anymore, but if I can find it, I'll be happy to mail it to you because you don't see it around a whole lot. But it's its own thing, and it's really neat. So I wanted to shout out Calicia because nobody talks about them, but I think they're really cool.
Okay, this is I was going to talk about this album, but the more I've sat here and thought about it, I think it's ahead of its time, but I thought initially it was ahead of its time, but really it kind of came out in the time it was supposed to. I mean, technology wasn't new to black metal at this point, and Matt, you kind of nailed it. And really, these guys, I really preferred their first album to anything they did afterwards. But But I really want to talk about, and these guys I wouldn't say are groundbreaking other than for their sheer intensity, and that is Sadus. Chemical Exposure, Illusions. This is some of the most intense thrash ever. And I'm sad that this band was on such a big label at the time and never really took off. They put out 5 albums in total, and people just didn't give a shit about Sadus, which is too bad because
they really didn't.
This album,
even when DiGiorgio joined Death, nobody cared about Sadus.
Right.
Like,
I mean,
what?
And the fact that DiGiorgio really shines on this stuff, the way that Rickenbacker bass cuts through, it's amazing. And this is some of my favorite thrash out there. And I had a buddy that saw them. They were on a tour with some other bands, probably Obituary and somebody else. They went and played and got a poor response, and they were all sitting at a table afterwards, all pissed off. My buddy went up and said, I came down to see you guys, and you just, the fact that, they're hitting at this heyday when thrash and death were starting to combine. People just didn't want to hear this thrash anymore. They wanted to hear death metal. And I think that's part of it. It kind of hit during that time too, but they were a great band. And
maybe they suffered from the same thing that Cynic suffered from. It just wasn't what the scene wanted to hear at that time.
But I mean, if you've never heard Sadus before, listen to the song Certain Death. Holy shit. You will not hear a more intense song. It's just a ripper, a complete ripper.
I know for me, it was a name I always heard about, but I never could find their stuff. Their stuff was never available anywhere. Finding Sadus albums in the wild just didn't happen. So I never heard them because I couldn't find the records.
That's weird because they're on Roadrunner or Road Racer. I mean, they should have got distribution unless they just didn't repress them for poor sale.
Yeah, I double checked, and they wasn't that. I thought maybe they were on a smaller label, but no, it wasn't that. I never came across Sadus stuff in the wild back then.
They probably just weren't being promoted as big as Obituary and Deicide and whoever else. Sepultura, yeah. I mean, the label's gonna put the money where the big selling acts are. So.
That's true. Looking at when the albums came out, it's like 1990, 1992. And that's everybody's really focused on death metal at that point. And those albums, quickly, but by 92, it was getting pretty hard to push a thrash band.
Yeah. Unless you've already established yourself like Metallica and Testament.
Yeah. Testament could still sell records then, but newer thrash bands weren't getting much attention at all by then. Not that they were new, but they just got, I guess, they kind of lost they were at the wrong time.
Yep. Did you have another one, Matt, or are you good?
I have one more. And this is my last one. And this one is going out to Jeff, Mr. Metal Madness himself. He had posted about this on Instagram the other day, and it brought it back to my memory. So I listened to it again. And holy shit, is Oxygene by Jean-Michel Jarre way ahead of its time. Not for metal. This is not a metal release at all. But as far as symphonic music goes, as far as like horror soundtrack music goes, as far as synthwave music goes, a lot of that you can track back to this late 70s electronica music. And holy crap, is this thing dark. I mean, just look at that album cover. I mean, that album cover is so awesome. I mean, it's one of the greatest album covers ever. And this album sounds like it could have been the soundtrack to Dawn of the Dead by George Romero. Before, like, this came out a year, maybe 2 years, but about a year before Goblin did the soundtrack for Dawn of the Dead. And you listen to this, and it's got really spooky, just really creepy keyboards all over it. And it's got a lot of hints for where, like, horror movie music soundtrack stuff went in the 80s. And all of that stuff is the main influence for the synthwave music that was, kind of big a few years back. And, you listen to this and you could have sworn that, this was a Carpenter Brute album that came out a year or two ago. You would have sworn this was a John Carpenter piece of music. No, I mean, this is Jean-Michel Jarre, and he did a really great album here. Definitely ahead of its time. One of the most metal album covers of all time. So I just wanted to give this a shout out. I know Jeff would appreciate seeing this. And I think anybody that, likes horror movie music would listen to this and just go, holy hell, that is some dark, creepy music. So put this on your Spotify lists, everybody. You're going to like this. That's what I'm going to leave you with.
Sweet.
Neat.
Well, I guess that's it. And I want to thank, first of all, everybody for coming around and hanging out with us tonight. And want to thank Matt for coming and hanging out with us tonight. Very cool. And you guys definitely and ladies all need to subscribe to Let's Talk Metal and The Dark Path. These guys are doing a great job with their channels. And I want to say, next week, we're going
if you announce it, you got to do it.
It's going to be set in stone. It's got to be.
Yeah. You can't back out.
It all depends on if he's available. We're going to get Aaron Margosian, the metal theologian, and we're going to go through the entire Manila Road catalog. Does not matter how long it's going to take.
Finally, guys. Jesus. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care how long it takes. We're going to get through it, and we're going to share our thoughts about a very influential band. And
time to hit the road.
And Matt will be coming back with us here in the future. He is going to
absolutely
partake in a Century Media top 10 Century Media chat that we're going to.
I already have them picked out. I'm ready to go. You guys want to just do it right now? I got it.
I'm not ready. I have to pick.
Let's go.
But we had a great time. Thank you so much, guys. And
it's great as always.
Yeah, next week.
That's off to you, everybody.
You gotta, Aaron, get your shit together. Start listening because it's coming. You make time. But thank you, everybody, and we will talk at you later. Does anybody else want to add anything before I shut us down?
It's been fun. Thanks to everybody for watching.
I'm exposed. So
you are exposed. See y'all later. End broadcast.